All right. Okay. Um, if you can all hear me, can you send me a hi via message? Cool. All right. Richard, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Cool. 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 Um, okay. What about you, Robert? Okay. So since we are all joining in, can you guys help me out? Mute your microphones and then send a hi through the chat box, just so I know everyone can hear me. All right. So Zookeeper, good. You can hear me. Robert can also hear me. What about Stephen? We already went through this, right? So you can hear me as well. All right. So Richard, can you hear me? Okay. I don't know if Richard can hear me, but in case you get this message and you can hear me, please send a hi through the message box. All right. So I'm going to jump right in real quick. Messi, thanks for joining. Can you mute your microphone for us, please?
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to run through intros real quick. Um, so my name is Edmond. Um, I currently work at Devless. Let me switch from. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, cool. Um, cool. So my name is Edmond. You can find me on Twitter. This is my handle. Currently, what I do is I work with Devless. So Devless is basically a backend as a service, and what backend as a service means is, for most part of your backend tasks, if you don't want to be writing them out, Devless kind of provides you stuff out of the box. A similar product would be something like Firebase, right? And so that's what I spend most of my time working on. Cool. So um, the topic of for today, it's it's about transitioning from using raw PHP to using a framework, and I kind of like laid out a couple of things that we'll go through as we go over the topic, right? And so we are done with the intros. We are good. Let's just kind of run through um, a couple of things about PHP in itself. So from the survey, most people had tried out stuff with PHP. So I'm going to assume like we all have a fair idea when it comes to PHP and what you can do with it. And so let's just clear the air. I'm still going to go over a few things that makes PHP unique as a language in itself, right? So I'm going to take this out here, and so if you've ever used PHP, you know it's incredibly easy to build a web app using PHP, right? In that, if I have a single page like index.php, I can literally load it up with a bunch of functions, mix it up with my HTML, I can have my CSS in there, and then my logic written as PHP, all in this script, and I can have my page up and running. And some of the basic usage of PHP you would find online is, or within people's projects, is creating contact forms, right? And so it's using PHP to do some of these, carry out some of these tasks is very simple and straightforward, right? And if you've never used a framework, then we can kind of assume that you have your entire app built out as a bunch of PHP scripts, right? And the topic here might seem like we are trying to get to the conclusion that writing raw PHP is it's not a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing either, right? As a matter of fact, if by the time you get to the end of this whole topic, you realize that if you can really actually manage it very well, then you might still want to keep going with Raw PHP. But then we're also going to look at some of the benefits you get by adopting a framework as well, right? So real quick, let me show you what Raw PHP, having a Raw PHP script might look like. So this is something I pulled out from my early days. This is like an old project, right? And this page, I think, let me just scroll down here. I don't remember what this page does. Yeah. So this page was for a simple search page that I created. So you can kind of like search for books and stuff like that, right? And so I kept my PHP script up top here, and basically what this page did, for example, in between here, was to list out people who are following me and people that I'm following, right? So although this page was for search, because on that same page I displayed follower and followers, I had to put this in here, right? And down here you see I have my CSS here, and then I have my HTML that actually had everything about the search and all of that, and even in between that I had PHP, right? And so straight ahead, and yeah, exactly, and I had my database query over here. In this case I was using SQLite, right? And straight ahead you can tell that it's kind of not well organized at all, right? In your case, I'm assuming people have way better Raw PHP scripts lying around, right? In my case, I think this was kind of like my first project, so it looked very, very bad, right? In this case, I even have my menu scripts being pulled in here, right? And so although PHP allowed me to have that flexibility, whilst I created my page, or whilst I worked through my project, I kind of like abused, or should I just say, because I didn't understand that maintainability of a project was a key thing, I kind of just put everything together, and this is what I kind of ended up with. And so if this project had continued for long, what would happen is that I wouldn't even be able to maintain it myself. Well, maybe I'll be able to maintain it personally, but then if I added one more person, because we have to kind of like grow up this project, it becomes a problem, right? And these are some of the challenges you have if you don't write out your Raw PHP scripts very well, right? And so I kind of like listed out some of the downsides if you decide to go this route by writing out Raw PHP. And if you don't, I have to emphasize, it's not that writing Raw PHP in itself is a bad thing, right? Hell, if you pick a framework, it's a bunch of PHP in itself. But then the problem is me not organizing my code very well, right? And this leads to some unmaintainable, like my page becomes unmaintainable because everything is not structured well. If we go back to the example I showed you, you see I have scripts in here doing SQL stuff. Down here somewhere I have HTML, JavaScript, all meshed up, right? And that's what we mean. That's what we mean when we talk about poorly structured code, right? And that's a typical example. And this leads to unmaintainable code, right? And let me kind of break this into two halves, right? Let's say I'm going to make this repetitive mistakes, and then let's just leave this as repetition. And so what repetition means here is that, for example, if I come back to this script, scroll up a bit, where we had the following, right? Like I mentioned earlier, this script is for a search engine, right? It's a simple search within my application, but then I have to repeat this section in every bit of my code, right? In that I want to display people who are following me and people I'm following on every page, right? I can kind of like pull this out and make it a dot, maybe let's say follow.php, and then pull this in every script that I have, which will be a better way to handle this. But sometimes you find yourself repeating yourself, especially when it comes to database queries, right? You kind of like repeat this over and over within scripts, right? So for example, I'm requiring this because I feel like it's a common part of my application, but then things like this, I cannot avoid repeating. And so I'll repeat this over and over in multiple pages, right? And the downside to this is if I have to change this, if this method execute doesn't exist anymore and it's now execution, I have to go through each and every page, changing this, changing executes to execution, which is going to be a pain if I have so many scripts lying around, right? And that is not going to that is going to be like, I'm going to have a hard time maintaining this project, right? And repetitive mistakes, right? This would usher us directly into why we would want to use the framework, right? Repetitive mistakes in this case is not necessarily mistakes on your part, but kind of like mistakes in the industry, right? Once we start talking about frameworks, web frameworks to be precise, you'd realize that there are some things that are kind of like practices that frameworks adopt, right? And if you are writing stuff or things on your own, or writing raw PHP for that matter, you kind of repeat these mistakes that frameworks have already solved, right? And so that's what I mean by repetitive mistakes, right? And these are some of the things we try to avoid by using frameworks, right? And just before we continue, we go through what a web framework actually is. In case you are having any difficulties or you want me to clear something up, this is not Q&A necessarily, but if you are having challenges whilst you are going through, you can kind of like leave me a message using the message box. Okay, so let's get back. So what do we mean when we say a web framework, right? And I know most of us would have ideas of web frameworks. If I ask right now what the examples of web frameworks are, I'll get a whole lot of examples, right? But then what does it mean? What should a web framework be doing, right? If you pick a web framework, what should we be looking to get out of the web framework? And really, to define web frameworks, let's start by defining frameworks, right? Let's start by defining frameworks. Let me shift here. Let's try and define what a framework is, right? In plain English, a framework is basically a kind of like a template. It's kind of like a template which you follow to get stuff done, right? And in this case, it means that it doesn't just apply to tech or web development. In this case, it applies to most fields like law, even accounting, right? So a framework is basically a template you follow through to get stuff done. And so if I prefix this with web framework, basically what we are looking at is a template that we follow. Right, so it's still a template we follow to get stuff done on the web, right? And that's like the basic definition of a web framework, right? And so what I expect a web framework to have, irrespective of the kind of web framework, once I pick this web framework, I'm expecting this framework to have a couple of things that are going to make my web development easier, right? And so based on the downsides or things we looked at when we touched on writing plain old PHP, what I expect a web framework to have, right, will be a well organized web structure or folder structure, right? And then the second most important thing I would want this framework to have is a better way to handle request and response as far as the web goes, right? Another thing I would expect this framework it would be a better way to handle data, right? So it would be a better way to handle data. I think someone just joined us, right? Please kindly mute your microphone for us, please. Right, and so yeah, back here. So I expect this this framework to have a well organized folder structure, a better way for me to handle request response. So when someone hits my page, how is this handled, right? When I want to send something back to this person, how is that handled, right? Do I send back an HTML page? Am I sending back JSON? All of these interactions, this framework should have a better way for me to handle all of this, right? And when it comes to data, I don't want to be handling raw SQL statements, right? And even if I'm going to be having to handle raw SQL statements, I should be able to do this in a better way, right? We can go on and on and on about what this web framework should contain, right? But for me, these are some of the key things, right? Let me just add one more thing: handle assets, right? And by assets, I mean how do my HTML, my images, CSS files, everything else, right? How this framework should better allow me to handle all of this, right? And on a light note, a better way for me to handle my logic as well, right? And so whichever framework I pick, me personally, these are the things I'm looking out for, right? How does this framework handle all of these things, and is it a better way than what I'm used to, right? And there can be more things I can get out of this, right? So let's deviate a little bit, right? Let's deviate a little bit. So we know there are many languages out there, right? We have languages like Python, we have languages like JS, which you can now use on the back end. So I'm referring to Node.js, right? Not JS on the front end, but Node.js, right? And then we can talk about Ruby, right? And then let's pick our own language that we are looking at here, which is PHP. Now, interestingly, unlike most of these languages, we know we can just pick up PHP in itself and then start building web apps. But for most of these languages, that is going to be a very, very hard thing to do, right? Because these frameworks do not have these languages do not have things out of the box to allow us be able to build web apps. So for example, if I want to build a web app out of something like Python, for me to be able to do this, Python, I can use Python inbuilt web server, right? But then I need to construct something known as WSGI, which is a standard for building web servers, so that I can use Python for web development, right? Which is code I have to write. But in the case of PHP, all of this is inbuilt. Once I have something called mod PHP, I can kind of like tie it against something like Apache and then just start running my website immediately, right? And this WSGI thing applies to a language like Ruby. In Node's case, you don't have to do that though. But then in Node.js case, it also has its unique problem, right? And its problem is, even to do something like handle request response, Node.js in itself, in the raw form, can't help you to do that, right? And so you need a framework like Express, right? And this is the point I wanted to draw out. If you pick a framework like Express against a framework like Laravel, right, the kind of things Express would have to give you out of the box, Laravel wouldn't have to concern itself with it, right? Because Express has to deal with things like response request, right? But something like Laravel thinks about other things and not have to deal with request response as far as building a framework goes, or as far as providing utilities out of the box goes. And also, interestingly, Express as a framework in itself does not deal with organizing folder structures, right? But something like Laravel does, right? Laravel handles folder structures for you. And so my whole point here is that, yes, a web framework is meant to make your work cleaner. It's meant to make your work cleaner and then also easy to write. But based on the stack you choose or the language you choose, you might get something a little bit different or way different out of the box as far as frameworks go, right? And so that's why it's important, before you choose an ecosystem to join or like a language to go with, if you know you're going to be doing web with this, you should look at the entire ecosystem and how web frameworks are packaged and given out for that particular language, right? And so basically that's what a web framework entails, right? And some of the reasons, I know that some of the reasons you want to be looking to use a web framework goes, right? And the first one is you get some part of your application out of the box for free, right? What do I mean by this? Well, in my script I gave earlier on, mind you, this query.php I have in my control folder here contains scripts that I had written to handle how I even query for data from a database, right? But for modern web frameworks, this is, you get all of these things right out of the box. Let me show you an example with something like Laravel, right? Let me go to my terminal here, and so I have Laravel running in Docker, which is something we'll look at sometime later on, depending on the need, right? So let me go into Devless here, and then open up a terminal there. Cool. So now I'll go into my Laravel project, right? And so first, let me ls to show you the kind of files you get in, say, a typical Laravel project, right? So these are the files you get in a typical Laravel project. This has changed a little bit in 5.5, right? The version of Laravel I have here is 5.0. So this has changed a little bit, but not so much. Outside here, it looks almost the same, right? And so for something like Laravel, your JS and then CSS files are all packed into the public folder, right? You can have it somewhere else. As a matter of fact, some of it are packed into a folder labeled as resource. Do not concern yourself so much about that. But let me just show you real quick some of the files you find in your public folder. So here I have my CSS, I have my favicon, I have my fonts, I have images, and some other files in here as well, right? And so that's what I meant by assets. A framework should be able to allow me to manage my assets. Anyways, let's look at databases, and as far as databases go, some of the things that get out of the box. And so to do this, Laravel provides you a built-in command line tool known as Artisan, which allows you to play around within the framework, right? So once I do Artisan Thinker, I get a command prompt that allows me to use Laravel commands. And one of the commands in there is db, right? So once I do db and I specify a table, say I know I have a table named services, right? And I do this get, it lists out everything I have in that particular table, right? And so this command I'm using here, I didn't have to write code for it, right? The moment I decided to use this framework, all of these things were built in, and I can kind of call on them, right? So you would have commands like insert, right? You have update, a whole bunch of commands that you can use, right? Laravel provides you all of this out of the box. So if I use a PHP command like get class methods, this should list everything that I can call out of this. Is it gets class methods, right? And so these are the methods that are available in DB that I can call. And so I can get the first record, I can get a value, I can convert it even into raw SQL statement just to see how it is, right? And so if I come back here and instead of get, I do to SQL, right? It generates the SQL command that is about to run for me to see everything in service. And so if you use something like MySQL and written raw SQL statements, you know that, oh, if you pick this and you plug it into PHP, you get the list of everything in your service table, right? But in this case, Laravel is providing me something that does that automatically for me, right? I don't have to write code for it. And so that's what I meant by you get stuff for free. But most importantly, right, is the fact that I don't have to maintain this code, right? Because the Laravel community is the one who provided all of this, right? They'll continue to maintain it as long as this project lives. And so for me, I don't have to maintain this code as well. But in this case where I have this, now it's up to me to maintain all of this, right? So from all the way from how I query my database to even how I do my search, I have to maintain all of that code, right? But in this case, Laravel community will be the one going to be maintaining all of this code for me. Well, that being said, at some point in your career or at some point where you've used Laravel to your satisfaction or you enjoy using Laravel and you feel like, you know what, because Laravel is giving me all of these things for free, I also want to contribute back. Then maybe you might want to start going to Laravel and looking into all of this and then contributing back and improving the software for others as well. But it will always remain the fact that you won't be the only one maintaining the software, right? A whole bunch of people are also available maintaining different parts of the software as well. And so together we build something much more solid. And that's also important, right? The fact that the software lives for a year, 2, 3, means that we identify broken parts and keep fixing them, right? Which we commonly known as bugs, right? And so we keep maintaining the software, building out broken parts and improving it, right? And so it becomes a much more solid software. And what this basically means is if I pick this statement right here and I compare it to whatever I have here, which is something I'm the only one maintaining, by the time because the Laravel community has so many people contributing back and improving this, right? I'll be much more assured that this wouldn't contain as many bugs as what I have here, and that gives me much more assurance that many parts of my application wouldn't be breaking, right? And so that's what this point kind of addresses. You being able to get stuff for free from a framework, and then the fact that you don't have to constantly be maintaining many parts of this of the entire part of your application. Cool. So the next point here is ease of understanding the application by other parties as well. So just like I started out explaining that for this part of my application, right, that I have in Raw PHP, I'm the only one who understands this currently. I don't think that anyone watching the going through the workshop now would assume that they understand. Once you see this, you understand whatever is happening here, right? It will take you time to walk through the code to kind of like understand what I'm trying to do here. When I say open error, what does it mean, right? But if I pick a framework, right, like Laravel, or if I go back to this command here, I bet you there are a whole bunch of people out there who understand what this does, right? Because somewhere someone is also learning this framework, which is kind of interesting, right? So just think about it. Somewhere in the world, someone is learning how to use all of this, right? Even before an application you are thinking to build in 2018 kicks off, right? Someone somewhere is already learning this, right? So kind of like before you even start your application to come use all of these things, someone already understands a part of your application. And that proves to be very, very important, right? And so it means if you build your application in 2018 and by 2019 your application is picking up, right, is growing rapidly, you don't have to spend time teaching people to understand your application, right? People would exist who understood many parts of your application even in 2015, right? And you can kind of get these people ready. These people join your project and are already ready to support, and they understand many parts of your application, right? So once they pick it up, they can quickly start building stuff and then improving stuff within your application, right? And so that's what I mean when I say it's easy for another person to understand your application provided you use a framework, right? And so maintainability here, it's also about the fact that your application is growing and you can still understand many parts of it. You can still add more stuff to it without it breaking, right? And the question will be, what ensures maintainability, right? And if you pick maintainability in itself, right? Maintainability for the web, let's see, right? If I pick maintainability for the web, what are the key things I should be looking out for? It's folder structure, right? If I have a good enough folder structure, then I know once my application keeps growing, it doesn't get messy, right? I don't have to be entangling include statements, require once, require this. It doesn't get all meshed up, right? And so as far as folder structure goes, if I have a good folder structure, I can kind of maintain what my application as it grows, right? And another thing will be, as part of folder structure, I don't know if I should do this now. Okay, I'll show you some other things that ensure maintainability once you start looking at key concepts of frameworks and what they should entail, right? But for now, when you think about maintainability, think about your folder structure and ways in which code is written, right? If you write your code in a way that you don't have to repeat yourself, right? And in the in the software development world, it's a term. There's a term we commonly use to describe not repeating yourself, and that is dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. That's the full meaning of it, right? And so if you practice dry, right, or if your framework allows you not to repeat yourself, then you know you're on your way to having a maintainable project, right? There are other minor little things that assure that the fact that assure you that you have maintainability, and one of them could be is actually how you use your variables, right? The way you use your variables ensure that your project can also be maintainable, right? I'm sure some of us have worked on projects where if you dare change the value of a variable, right, things will start breaking apart, right? Or you won't get an error, but sometime along the line, stuff will start breaking, right? And these are some little things that can break maintainability in one's application. But the bottom line is, if you are writing raw PHP, right, chances are you run into this problem where you have so many global variables. That's like one of the commonest examples. You have so many global variables that if you dare repeat the same variable and use it in another context, things wouldn't work, right? And that is a big problem, right? And frameworks kind of like ensure that we don't end up having to deal with some of these things, right? But for me, one of the biggest things as far as using a framework goes, right, is the kind of job openings and opportunities that you get. So remember when we began all of this, I mentioned that writing raw PHP might not necessarily be a bad thing. That is if you know how to go about it, right? But for many reasons, for other reasons, you might also want to learn to use a framework. And the reason for this is job opportunities and openings. And an example will be this: if you go on any job board, or if anybody is looking to employ a PHP developer, most likely you hear them shouting out that they want a Laravel developer, right? You wouldn't hear them necessarily mentioning that they want a PHP developer, because the assumption is that if you can write if you can do Laravel, then you can write PHP, right? And so if you are confident enough that you'll be able to write raw PHP for your project, you might want to consider picking up a framework, just so that you are opening up, you open yourself up for job opportunities and openings out there, right? And so me personally, when it comes to JavaScript's framework, right, I do not use them more often on my personal projects, right? But then I keep my skills sharp when it comes to something like Vue.js, right? Just so when there are job openings, I can pick them up and then use Vue.js in that context. And so, one of the key important things, or one of the things you might want to look at when you decide to use a framework, is learn it enough so that you can use it for job openings, right? Kind of like open yourself up to many job openings as well. Cool. So let's jump in. Let's go deeper into frameworks, right? Let's just talk a little bit more about frameworks and what they entail, right? These days you would hear so these days, when we talk about frameworks, right, especially around the 2005, around the time we had frameworks like Django, Rails coming to the scene, right? One of the key concepts, right, very key concepts in web frameworks is MVC, right? And I know most of us would know the full meaning of MVC here, right? And M here standing for model, view, and controller. controller, right? And these terms mean nothing more than if we talk about models, then what we are talking about is anything to do with data as far as our application goes, right? And if we talk about views, it's basically how we present data to this user, right? And the most commonest way we do this is through rendering HTML, right? Another way is to serve JSON, which it's kind of like if we are working on a mobile app, then we would want JSON to feed into our mobile apps. But more recently, there's this term SPA, which is for single page applications, which is basically a way for you to detach your front end, right, or your HTML bits from your back end, right? And so if you do that split, then your back end, which could be something like Laravel, wouldn't be spitting out HTML, but JSON, which you give to your front end, which is your single page application, right? And I wouldn't concern myself so much right now about JSONs and SPA. And so in layman's terms, just think about views as how you present data to your user, right? And the commonest way to do that is HTML, right? So in between picking data from a database or putting data to your database, presenting this to the user or taking it out via the views, in between that you have the controller, right? And so the controller is basically where you keep your logic, right? Or should I say the controller is all about your logic, right? And so it contains code that controls how data flows between your model and then your view, right? And so the reason why I'm saying that, or I'm thinking this is the core of modern frameworks, or the core concept of modern frameworks, is the fact that if you pick a framework like Rails, there's literally a folder structure or a folder directory labeled controller, where you're expected to keep all your logic in, right? And I don't remember though if Rails comes with a folder labeled models, but then you kind of like have, I think there's a schema folder or file, and there are a whole bunch of files tucked away somewhere where it's all about working with data, right? And then you kind of like get things like this, right, which allows you to work on your model or with your data, right? And so when you are learning a framework and you are thinking about parts and how you work with data, right, just tune your mind to the fact that you are learning everything about models, right? And controllers are basically where you keep your code. So let me quickly show you what a sample model will look like. And so I think I have a sample controller will look like, sorry, right? And so I have the controller here labeled user, right? And so this user controller is all to do with anything user, right? And so when I'm getting, okay, so this application is a little bit contains a little bit, it's way complex, so it contains a little bit more. So I'll open a more recent project. And cool, yeah. So let's open this up, and then let's look for the user controller. I think I should have one here, right? Cool. And so the user controller here, right? And so there's something called index, and if I open index, I can get a list of users. And so look at this. This right here is a model, right? And so if I do user dot or I'm getting every user and then serving this right into my application, right? And this kind of like very easy. And look at how clean this controller looks, right? I don't want to bore you so much with the entire concept, but I want you, if there's any keyword I want you to take away, is the keyword that MVC, right? MVC is kind of like key when we are talking about web framework, modern web frameworks. And so when you're learning modern web frameworks, these are the things you would want to be looking out for, right? And there are two kinds of frameworks, right? There are frameworks, there are batteries, there are frameworks we call batteries included, right? And then we have micro frameworks. Batteries included frameworks include things like Django, Laravel, and what these frameworks are all about is the fact that they have everything you need to build a complete web app, right? So they provide you a whole bunch when it comes to models, controllers, and views. And so you don't have to write extra code to do stuff. Now there's another kind of framework, the micro frameworks, which give you very little, not so much, right? And the reason for micro frameworks is the fact that sometimes for some applications you are building, you don't need so much, right? And so they don't give you so many things to build out your web app. And so let me quickly go here and show you an example. Will be an example of a micro framework would be Lumen, and then Slim framework here. I think it's slimframework.com, right? And then Laravel itself, which is not a micro framework, which is a big framework, right? It's a batteries included framework. And so, for example, a sample Lumen app will look like this, right? Very simple. You declare a route. A route is basically the URL you want your user to hit, and then you write your code here, which is what you want your user to see when they hit that route, right? Very, very simple, very straightforward, right? And it's the same with something like Slim, right? You can kind of see like Slim also has this route here, and you can kind of write your code out here, right? And so sometimes I would advise that if you are jumping into frameworks for the first time, you might want to try out micro frameworks, right? And they kind of like make things very easy. And so one common thing you see micro frameworks lacking is an ORM. And an ORM is basically a tool. ORM is basically a tool that allows you to handle your model, right? And some of the frameworks like Laravel have inbuilt ORMs known as Eloquent, right? Known as Eloquent, that makes things very easy for you. And so for micro frameworks, you have to write. Unfortunately, you have to still write your SQL statements out there, out yourself. Sorry, but then you can kind of use some tools out there like not ORM that you can pair up with something like Lumen or Slim framework, and then kind of like get all of these things also for free. So it kind of explains how you can add it and use it and all of that, right? We are kind of going behind time, so I'm going to run through this real quick. We pick up questions, and then we can kind of like continue. You can kind of like continue asking your questions as we go. And so yeah, we have two kinds of frameworks: the batteries included, and then the micro frameworks. Usually, I would advise that if you are getting started with frameworks, you should try out micro frameworks and kind of work your way into bigger frameworks like Laravel. And so if you are going to use something like Laravel, you might want to start out with Lumen, because Lumen is by the Laravel community. And so it makes it, and they have easy ways for you to move your Lumen app into Laravel, right? And so real quick, what are some of the challenges? Of course, everything has its downsides, right? So what are some of the downsides for using something like using a framework, right? Of course, there's going to be a learning curve, right? And so that command I just wrote out here, if you've never used Laravel, I don't expect you to know it. And the reason is that you've not learned it, right? And so if you're going to pick up all of these things in addition to everything else that you need to be able to use a framework, there's going to be some learning curve, right? The second thing is that there are some constraints, right? So especially to give you maintainability right out of the box, certain constraints have to be set just so that that can be achieved, right? And the funny thing about constraints is you kind of feel constrained with the framework when you're getting started, right? But after some time, all of these fade away. Although there are still some challenges you might face with frameworks, right? But we'll kind of like walk through some of these constraints based on the kind of, I'll put out another workshop. Of course, we are going to have subsequent workshops, and we'll look at some of these constraints once we start looking at frameworks in itself. And so towards the closing of this workshop, I'm going to echo this out again. You might not need to use a framework, right? You don't always have to be using a framework, or you don't have to necessarily move away from writing raw PHP. And these are some of the reasons. If you are creating a framework yourself, right? Or if you are confident and you are creating a framework yourself, then you might not want to build your framework on top of a framework, right? The second thing is scaling, right? And scaling here I have an asterisk. The reason being that I have code here, right? That when I run would get me data, right? Which is this statement here. This statement here, right? It's going to get me data. The SQL statement that it's running underneath, which we saw earlier with real quick, to SQL, right? We saw underneath here is something the Laravel guys have added for me. Sometimes you run complex query statements, right? Query statements using these kind of things, these kind of constructs. and you end up not getting an optimized SQL statement, right? In this case, the framework there is limiting you, right? And that's an example of a constraint, right? And you run into scaling issues once your app grows very big, right? In that case, you might not want to use a framework. But this is the catch there. If you are going to, if scaling is going to happen to you, then probably you would have started with a framework, and then now your framework, lots of people are using your application so much so that you want to move away from the framework. And so sometimes you wouldn't want to necessarily move away from the framework, but you change how you use the framework, which is why I left it as an asterisk. So it doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't want to start with a framework, but it means it's something you want to look out for once you start growing big, right? And sometimes you're just writing some simple PHP script. You don't need an entire framework for that, right? Or you're still writing raw PHP, but you know what you are doing, right? In that case, you don't have to necessarily move onto using a framework, right? And so towards the closing, I'm going to give you a few resources that would help you whilst you are trying to transition from writing raw PHP to using a framework, right? And the first, that's if you are going to use Laravel, is the Laravel documentation. I haven't seen any framework have so good a documentation as Laravel, right? You can literally learn everything using the documentation, right? It's very, very, very helpful, right? Another place is Laracast, which I'm sure many people know. So Laracast provides you good tutorials on PHP, Laravel, everything you need to start your Laravel career, right? It's a very, very good platform for learning. So it's video tutorials mostly, right, for learning Laravel. And another thing I advise most people to do is follow the development of Laravel, right? And so if you go to Twitter, and this should apply to any other tool you are using, right? If you go to Twitter, please try and follow Laravel, kind of like follow Taylor Otwell, join in on podcasts, Laravel podcast. Just follow what the trends, what's happening in Laravel, what are the new things that are coming up, right? So you can follow them up on Twitter. You can follow them up on Twitter. Check out the Laravel podcast. I think it's Laravel podcast, right? So follow the Laravel podcast. Get yourself immersed into the community and kind of like learn and understand what is going on there and some of the things that is interesting things happening with the framework, right? And so on that note, I think I'm almost out of time, right? So on that note, I'm going to end here, and then you can kind of like ask questions here for like the next 1 minute. For like the next, I think 10 minutes, and then we can kind of like close this. But I'll still be available on the on the WhatsApp group to answer any questions you might have. So yep, you can use the message box here. Ask questions, we answer them, and then we can kind of like close the session. But I'll still be taking questions on the WhatsApp group as well. Cool. Must you know OOP PHP to learn Laravel? That's kind of like an interesting question. So you don't have to know OOP to use Laravel, right? You can kind of like have your way for a while, right? So you can use Laravel without understanding OOP in itself. But if you have basis of OOP, it kind of helps, right? But actually, I know someone who has learned OOP by using Laravel, right? And so it will surprise you that it's OOP that is making something like this possible, right? And the interesting thing is, you should have known OOP to better write raw PHP. And so you could have created this thing yourself if you understood raw PHP, and if you understood OOP in PHP, right? But now you don't have to do that on the first go. You can kind of like ease in to understanding Laravel and move on from there to understanding OOP. Yeah. Any more questions? I think we have 9 minutes more. Take a couple of questions, then we go. What is the best operating system for Laravel? So Laravel in itself has tried a whole lot to make it easy for you to install it across board, right? And so you can do it for Windows, you can do it for all other operating systems. In my experience, so there are challenges generally with PHP and then Windows, right? You have OpenSSL issues and a whole bunch of other things. So normally you find it way easier to do it on something like Mac OS or Linux, right? But then it doesn't mean you can't work your way through to installing it on something on an operating system like Windows. But I would say, just to give you an answer, I would say you find it easier to do it on Mac OS and Linux. But it doesn't mean you can't do it on something like Windows. For example, I've done installation of Laravel for people using Windows, using Docker. So I've Vagrant, there's Vagrant. Laravel also provides Homestead, which also makes it easy. Yeah. ORM helps you manage your models. What do you mean by that? Cool. So you know you have to work with data, and normally if you are writing raw PHP, you would want to be you would be writing raw SQL statements, right? And so what the ORM does, right, is basically provides you what I'm getting with Laravel here, right? All of these sweet things I'm writing without necessarily having to write the raw SQL statements underneath here, right? And so ORMs kind of like gives me ways to handle how do you call it, to handle data as I work with it. Technically there's a difference between models, right? And then there's a difference between models and then how do you call it, ORMs. I'll kind of clear that up in subsequent talks. Best learning steps that you will recommend for as beginners. Yeah, so what the first thing I'll recommend is, sorry, I had this line here. Yeah, exactly. Projects, right? Do as many projects as you can. I know it's down to like, I don't even understand the basics. What do you mean by start out with a project, right? I also felt the same, but I just gave up and then decided to start working on projects. And so the cool thing about projects is nobody is going to use your first project, and so it's a good starting point. Don't be afraid that it's not going to scale or people would laugh at you and all of that. Just pick be like, oh, I want to design a rental platform, right? And then start working through. This is the interesting thing. I don't need to give you the exact steps you should follow, but once you pick up a project, you can begin asking the right questions to completing that particular project. And these are the questions. Once you start asking these questions, the knowledge you gain out of that, finishing off that particular project, it's knowledge you can use in other projects. And so if you have other questions for other projects, you kind of like ask for those ones as well, and you can kind of build off from there, right? And so I would say projects. Sorry, so what OS am I using? So I'm using Debian, and if I'm sure the reason you are asking for the OS is not necessarily about the OS, but it's how it feels and it works, right? So I'm using, instead of the normal Debian Windows Manager, I'm using i3 Windows Manager, W3, I think it's i3 Windows Manager. It gives you this nice bar here and all of that, right? It's really cool and it's very efficient. So it tiles your windows and makes things very easy for you as you work, right? So I'm using Debian OS with i3 installed. Cool. So I have to quickly move on to the next Skype call. But if you have any questions, I can quickly answer those before I join in on the call. So if there are any more, you can throw them at me. I'm really glad you guys were able to join and then kind of like ask all of these questions, and then also it's kind of like a great experience just to know about the developer community here and what everyone is looking at, right? And so before I end all of this, let me share a feedback link which would kind of like help me understand what you guys think about this and how we should be going about this and some of the things you want to see and all of that, right? And so I've shared the link that you guys can provide a feedback on through. Once I get these, I would understand what you guys feel about this training and what you look forward to, right? If there are no questions, I'll allow for one last questions. But if there are no questions, exactly at 4, I would have to end the workshop and then join in on another Skype call. So I'm still going to be here for the next 2 minutes just so we end everything officially. But thank you guys for joining me. for joining in on the workshop. It's been a great experience. Thank you guys.